Hello and welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning in partnership with the Harvard Alumni Association. I'm pleased to welcome our speaker this evening, Eric Soto-Shed, who is a lecturer on education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Without further ado, Eric, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'd like to say welcome to everybody in this meeting today. And I'm really excited and honored to be able to share, I think, what is really the most central work that we need to be doing in schools these days with thinking about how can we really engage controversy and embrace controversy in our courses, particularly focused around civic education. I should say that along with, having trained teachers for the past 20 years, I come as a former New York City high school teacher where I taught social studies, civics, and history. And so I both appreciate and really respect the hard work that teachers are doing now to really help young people think critically and thoughtfully around controversial issues. And I'm excited to share a little bit of that work today. So what I want to do is just begin with a roadmap, let you know where we're going and what we're going to be doing in this session. And so the main question that we want to take on here is how can educators engage with controversial topics while mitigating harm to students? And the basic sort of flow, we want to begin by unpacking this dilemma for educators. Then I want to share a framework that I've developed for teaching controversial topics, really apply that frameworks to a couple of curricular examples so you can get a sense of what it looks like. And then close with some final thoughts about where I think this work can head and some things that I'm wrestling with. And then we'll leave a lot of time for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, very much looking forward to engage in a back and forth towards the end of our time together. So this is our roadmap. So this is what you signed up for. Come on, let's get to it. And again, thank you for your time today. So I want to just begin by defining some terms so we're really clear on what we're talking about. So when I use the term controversy and teaching controversy, really we're talking about teaching controversial issues. And I draw on the work of Diana Hess, a lead scholar in teaching controversial topics and issues, and really identify these three characteristics: competing perspectives, issues that may cause emotional response, and issues that are potentially open for debate. And it's those last two characteristics around the potential for emotions and the potential for debate that I think are really going to be some of the key ideas that teachers are going to wrestle with as they think, how can we bring controversy into the class? And when we look at the moment that we're in right now in 2025, there's no short list here. I need probably 4 more slides to name all the controversies that are circulating right now. And for each of these controversies, I think we all recognize that we're in a particularly charged and polarized moment. And so the nature and the balance of these controversies are really, really strong in some ways that seem quite unprecedented. And so it's more important than ever to be teaching about these things. It's also more challenging. And so how do we do it? So this idea around teaching controversy really, really began to become deeply seated in my practice in 2015. And this was actually my first year here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I was supporting teachers in a nationwide residency program. And so we had a new teacher who was in Denver, Colorado, teaching 6th grade ancient civilizations. And in one of our coaching sessions, the teacher came to me and said, Eric, my students, and this teacher was working with students from either who were undocumented or came from families with some undocumented family members, and several other students who are immigrants as well. And she said to me, Eric, my students are really scared. And this was the moment in 2015 during the presidential election where the idea of building a wall became a really sort of popular, slogan and really campaign pledge by at the time candidate Trump. And the teacher was at her wit's end around, what do I do? My students are hearing like all sorts of rumors. They don't know how to understand this policy. They don't understand what they're hearing in the news, but they're scared. And that was something I'd never quite wrestled with in my career in teaching. I taught from about 1999 to 2007. I taught through 9/11 in New York City, and there were a whole host of issues that were charged. But this idea of young students really feeling fear around their immigration status at this scale, at this intensity, was something that was simply unprecedented for me. And so what I did is, we really kind of talked it through in terms of working with this teacher to think through what is it that your students are wondering about? What is it they're scared about? And what can you do in your ancient civs class, by the way, to really begin to help them both understand the issue and also feel some degree of safety? And I cannot say that, we came up with a magic solution in terms of here's the elixir to sort of solve their fear, but we did come up with some sort of, I think, really basic ideas that worked well in terms of giving an opportunity for students to express themselves in class, to share where they were, either through writing or speaking, to really let them know about the community and the commitments and the values around their safety and their belonging, and just to provide a space for some processing and reflection. And the year went on. There was some progress in terms of students being able to engage with the issue. And again, there's no magical ending to this story other than the teacher was able to work through and support her students throughout the year. What I want to do now is fast forward to 2019. I'm working with another teacher now who is a new teacher in New York City in the Bronx, actually where I taught for a number of years. And this teacher also taught many students who were from immigrant backgrounds, many Dominican students, to be specific. And this teacher wanted to do a debate on immigration policy, really looking at, should the United States provide a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants? And I talked to this student. I was like, I've been reflecting on this, from working on this for a few years, and I think you want to think twice about potentially opening this up for debate, where you have some students who could potentially be implicated in this debate. We don't want to end up essentially debating people's humanity. And a student said to me, you know what? I know my kids. They've been talking about this kind of on the margins. I've been overhearing them. They've been asking me. We have a really strong community. I think they're ready. I think that I want to kind of put this debate out there. And I said, okay, I trust your judgment. I'm here as your coach. I can support you. And in the back of my mind, I was like, I don't know how this is going to work out. And the teacher taught the lesson and reported that it just went phenomenal in terms of students were able to express different views. She did exit tickets and check-ins to see how students were feeling afterwards. It was a productive, rich debate, one that was also carefully curated by the educator in terms of the sources that they looked at from different perspectives. And so that was a tremendous example for me of the power of exploring these issues in a more debate fashion. But it left me in a sort of a conundrum with this big question. And really what the question was is that, how do we think through teachers supporting students to explore controversies when their identities are at stakes? In some cases, like this student that I worked with in 2015, students are terrified. And in other situations, students can be really, really engaged and explore the arguments. And so what do we do? And so the puzzle here is, what should educators do when controversies directly implicate or affect their students' identity? And there are no shortage of issues, again, when we think about beyond just immigration policy, trans rights, policing, viewpoint diversity, Israel and Palestine, affirmative action. These are issues that not only are really charged and can implicate students in K-12 space, but we see it in higher ed and even here at our own institution at Harvard. And so the puzzle leads to attention. And it's this idea of teachers affirming students' identity versus the idea that you want to have a class where you can share ideas freely. And let me just show you an example. What I want to do is I want to pull up some guidelines from the Massachusetts standards for teaching. And so these are standards that all teachers must meet to be qualified and licensed teachers in the state of Massachusetts. And here's what they say. Teachers must create and maintain a safe, supportive, and inclusive environment by modeling and reinforcing respect for and affirmation of differences related to background, identity, language, strengths, and challenges. So you really need to be able to affirm students' identity and their background. The very same standard also asks teachers to create an environment where you're enabling students to take academic risk and share ideas freely, right? And so herein lies this tension. On one hand, teachers are asking to create a space where we affirm students' identities. And the other hand, we're asking to create a space where students can share ideas freely. But what do we do when those two goals clash. We can look at this more broadly when we see what teachers are wrestling with and thinking about themselves. So we see here from this EdWeek survey done in 2024, nearly 80% of teachers said that it is a responsibility of schools to teach students how to have respectful conversations about important topics where people may disagree, right? At the same time, we know about 65% of teachers nationally reported deciding to limit discussions about political and social issues in the class. And so, on one hand, we see the great need to explore controversies and topics where there's some differences. And the other hand, we see a retreat from that. And so, part of what I see in terms of how do we wrestle with this is this idea of dilemma management, right? And this is an idea from Magdalene Lampert, where it talks about the ways teachers thoughtfully respond to challenges that arise when conflicting education values or goals are at play. And so here I see the two sort of conflicting values. One is the value of teaching controversy, of open expression, of free exchange of ideas. And then the other is this wanting to affirm students' identities and to mitigate harm so they don't feel attacked or threatened, right? And so how do teachers wrestle with this? And so it's precisely in trying to think through this dilemma that I came up with this sort of key question that guides my work around how can educators engage with controversial topics while also mitigating harm to students? And so what I want to do now is shift from sort of saying, here's the problem, to sharing a framework for teaching controversy to maximize learning while mitigating harm. Because again, I want to underscore, we need, as educators and as a society, to be leaning into controversies, to be embracing them. This is where I think key learning happens, but also key sources of friction. So rather than retreat from them, how can we center them in the classroom while also mitigating harm? And so to introduce my framework, I want to kind of begin with sort of a simple equation here. And what I start with is this way of thinking. If you look at how charged the issue is, and to the extent that your students might be implicated in that issue, that can greatly inform your goals and instruction for education. And so to lay it out for you, I create this spectrum. On the left side, it's bright red. These are issues that are really charged and the likelihood of harm is high, right? On the right side, you see kind of the green, or those are issues that aren't that charged. The likelihood of harm is little to none, right? And when you're on this more charged left side, the suggestion and the recommendations of the framework is you want to take a more exploratory approach to your instruction. So the goals here would be to reflect, to understand, to analyze the issue. And when you're on this less charged, less likely to cause harm side, you can be much more comfortable taking an argumentative debate style where you're really kind of pitting students and their views against each other. And I always want to preface this by saying that this is just one way to guide instruction. And what I'm really thinking about are the number of teachers that are really uncertain or reluctant to teach into controversies because their response to be thinking about potential harm for students. So how can we both sort of honor the students and their safety and well-being while also jumping into these charged issues? And so what I want to do right now is I want to walk through some examples of how we could apply this framework. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you some lessons, and I'll share with you sort of the lesson topic, the goals of the lesson or the discussion, and the structure and format, and how these are informed by where they fall on the spectrum, okay? Let's take a look at the first example. Here we have all the way to the left side. Remember, the red is charged and there's like likely implication and harm. And so here's an example of a January 6th discussion, a discussion about the January 6th attack on the Capitol. But it was taught in Washington, D.C. the day after. It was designed by my colleague, Rebecca Schuveller, who helped me develop this framework over a number of years and was teaching at the time in D.C. And so here you can imagine it's the day after the attack on the Capitol. You have young people in near proximity. They're wondering what's going on. This is a school-wide advisory discussion that needs to happen across different advisory classrooms. And so the idea here was like, we need to engage this issue. So we can't not talk about it, but How are we going to do it? And so the goals here are simply to surface and explore existing stances. We're not going to debate. We're not going to argue. We're going to lay out what we kind of know about the events and really give an opportunity for students to kind of weigh in. This is what's on my heart. This is what's on my mind. This is what I'm wondering about. And so this is a facilitated circle where students, it's highly structured. Students can opt out if they want to. They're not forced to sort of participate. And it's just a way in for these teachers the day after this really powerful event to begin to engage the young people in their classrooms. So highly charged, we're going to try to explore some stances here, not necessarily argue or debate. Moving along the trajectory, let's take the issue of transgender students in sports, participation in sports. Here we have several states that are passing policies that limit the participation of transgender students. These are real events that are happening and real policies that are happening. At the same time, there's a great likelihood that teachers have transgender students in their classrooms. They're thinking about how best to support them. And so we want to get into this sort of controversy. We want to get into these policies. But again, we're not going to argue. So what we can do is we can look at some of the policy, some of the proposed legislation, but the goal here is to describe and analyze somebody else's thinking, proponents or opponents of legislation. And again, this will be a text-based discussion where you're going to anchor it in sort of what other folks are saying, really try to understand these positions, but we're not taking that argumentative position yet, because again, we don't necessarily want to have a transgender student in our classroom who may have aspirations, desire, and be on a particular athletic team, and really have to hear that this should not be happening, that their reality should not exist. Okay, so let's move along now. Okay, so we've gone from really charged to something that might be a little less charged. And now I want to go to the other extreme. So let's take the electoral college debate, or if I want to get like real contemporary in the moment, gerrymandering, right? These are unbelievably important issues that are central to the vitality of our democracy. But it's a good hunch that we could have a good hunch that in most classrooms, your average 16 and 15-year-old is not going to feel that their identity and their sort of selfhood is tied up in these debates. And so that's an issue where we could feel, I think, much more confident as teachers. So like, let's divvy this up into some sides. Let's get into that opposition. Let's argue for each side and really kind of get kids to engage with each other in a much more argumentative sort of approach. So finally, I want to end with this idea of felon voting and around this idea of a structured academic controversy. I'll just take a moment to explain what a structured academic controversy is. It looks like a debate where you have sides, right? So you might be like, convicted felons should be allowed to vote, convicted felons should not be allowed to vote. But the whole goal is not to win the side you're assigned. It's simply to present it. Then you abandon your sides and you work with a small group to try to come to consensus to where differences lie. And so it's not quite as charged as debate, because the goal is not to win the side you were assigned, but rather to really present a side, understand both, and then try to come to some consensus. And so here's an issue where, again, the likelihood of students' identity being deeply tied to this, not tremendously high. I mean, I did work with students who both themselves and their family member had certain convictions, but generally speaking, they're charged. This topic is not necessarily as charged, so we could feel a little bit more comfortable kind of, again, having kids kind of looking at it from different sides and really putting those two sides in conversations. So I want to pause for a moment, having just walked through this sort of basic framework where we're saying something that's more charged, the goal might be more exploratory. Can we reflect, understand, and analyze? But when it's less charged and we don't think it's going to show up in the classrooms that we're in, we can feel much more quickly to begin the exploration with an argumentative or debate type of approach. I would just love for a moment to pause and kind of hear from folks on the call here to think about, for familiar K-12 context. So there's going to be a school that you went to, a school that you work in, a school that your children attend. What is a controversial issue you think should be addressed using more of an exploratory or an argumentative approach? So for example, and you can respond to the chat. For example, you might say immigration policy. I feel that could be really argumentative in the context that I'm familiar with. You might feel different about a different issue. So I'd love if folks could take a moment to just drop in the chat some thoughts about an issue that you think might lend itself more towards an exploratory approach or an argumentative approach. I'm going to take a peek in the chat right now. Thank you. First one see here is food insecurity is more exploratory. Love this example. Offshore wind, some real implications, but that could be a little bit more argumentative. Abortion rights, exploratory. Healthcare access, argumentative. Israel-Palestine, exploratory. And that really resonates with me. I think my first entry point into Israel and Palestine when I was teaching in the past couple of years has been to really do a much more exploratory circle. Affirmative action, exploratory. Political polarization, exploratory. And so I thank you for letting these come in. I recognize some more might come in. And what I want to suggest is that a lot of this is context dependent, right? It's about knowing your students and your community and how the issue shows up. And so this was the first phase of the framework that Rebecca Schugel and I developed around 2020, 2021. And after utilizing it with a bunch of educators, we began to realize that folks need to know more like, okay, we got the goal, but what else do we do with this? Okay. And so what I want to do now is kind of walk you through sort of the second phase of the framework. And how do we go from thinking about goals to really get into instruction? Okay. So here's the framework, and here are 4 steps that I want to walk us through. Okay. The first step is you're going to analyze the issue for potential harm. That's what we've really done already. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to think about, given how I've analyzed this for potential harm, how am I going to frame the issue? How am I going to think about how this shows up in my classroom? The third thing is you'll determine very specific instructional goals. And the fourth thing is you'll develop your plan. Some key things to lever when you're planning is think about the language that you use, the perspective that you expose students to, and what student interaction looks like. So what I want to do right now is just walk through these steps with an example. I like to think of this as 2 teachers, 1 topic, 2 different lessons, right? Based on how they apply the framework. The topic is going to be immigration policy in the context of the 2024 election. And this comes from my work with several teachers trying to think through how to teach the election and approach the election last year. And specifically, immigration policy at the time being proposed, it's the idea of mass deportation, which in 2025 we're seeing the look and feel of that in very different ways than simply a proposal. But in the context of 2024, the idea of mass deportation was actually supported by 58% of registered voters, including 24% registered Democrats, right? And so this was an issue that was very, very contentious with some support. So I want to walk us through kind of how Mr. Smith and Ms. Clark, these are composite teachers that I kind of created based on teachers I've worked with, how they would deal with it in their context, okay? And I'm gonna start with the reveal with the answer. Mr. Smith is going to end up doing a lesson around immigration policy in 2024 that's going to center around journaling, reflections, and questions, because Mr. Smith found himself on the very charged side of the spectrum. Ms. Clark is actually going to do a structured academic controversy where students are going to look at an issue from both sides and take a position, finding herself on the less charged side of the framework. And what we're going to do right now is kind of walk through those 4 key steps to see how they thought through this particular issue. So, analyze the issue for harm, considering your context. So Mr. Smith teaches it in an area where, my students are 85% Latinx, many are first or second generation immigrants, and some are undocumented. Miss Clark, on the other hand, my students are about 60% white. The rest are evenly split among Black, Asian, and Latinx kids. She does not teach any newcomers. And she knows that there's varied opinions and a lot of indifference on immigration policy, okay? So Mr. Smith is anticipating, a high likelihood of harm. He can't be certain, but there's a high likelihood that there's going to be some potential harm when we talk about these policies of immigration. And Ms. Smith is feeling a lot less likely. Sorry, Ms. Clark is feeling a lot less likely. So now let's talk about how do we frame the issue, okay? So, Mr. Smith, I want to avoid questioning the right of any student to be in our classroom, so I'm staying away from mass deportation. However, I am going to dive into the issue. I will ask my students, what do we think and feel about the proposed policy's potential to cause harm? That's the framing for Mr. Smith. Ms. Clark, on the other hand, is going to approach it a little differently. Ms. Clark also wants to avoid questioning the right of any person to be in our community. So not necessarily in our classroom, but in the broader community. So I'm staying away from mass deportation. Somewhat similar rationale. However, Ms. Clark, concludes, I will ask, should our next president restrict immigration more? Okay. And so that's really beginning to dig into the controversy and really beginning to put this idea of immigration and restricting it up for something for students to explore and take a stand. So we have slightly different framings based on how they've analyzed the issue in step one. So now let's get into the specific goals and what these lessons can look like. Okay. For Ms. Clark, state kind of takes this perspective. Many of my students don't know a lot or seem to invest in an issue. I want them to be able to evaluate the different positions and make a claim for one side. Mr. Smith, on the other hand, argues, my intention is for students to have the space to reflect for themselves. Because this issue is so personal, it's important to have a space to process. Okay. So Mr. Smith, we're having much more goals around processing and reflection. And for Ms. Clark, it's much more about taking a position, evaluating different positions, and making a claim. So now we're going to get into the planning. What do they actually do? What do they bring to their classrooms? So for Ms. Clark, one of the decisions she makes is that, you know what, we're going to look at, sides, for limiting or against limiting immigration, but we're going to stay away from the term illegal, and we're going to use the term undocumented, really for the reasons around trying to look at both sides of the issue, but do it in a way that fully humanizes people. And for Ms. Clark, the idea of referring to folks as illegals dehumanizes, and there you can still open up the debate by simply using different terms, specifically the term undocumented. For Mr. Smith does want to look at the policies and does want to look why these could be harmful, but some arguments are baseless and offensive. So he's going to curate resources. So he's not going to necessarily expose the students to the rawest language or the most baseless claims, and begin to look at them at some critiques around or some documents that support the idea that we should limit immigration, but not in the most inflammatory way. Okay. So they're curating the sources, curating what students are exposed to and how they're having the dialogue. Finally, we could think about student interaction. And this really revolves around, let's first look at Mr. Smith. So Mr. Smith says, because of pre-existing strong opinions and the high potential for harm, I want to pick an eternal approach, right? So rather than having a bunch of sort of dialogue going around, they're going to do some journaling. I will not assign a side because this is too personal for my students. Okay. So we're not going to have folks in opposition, and there's actually going to be a lot of independent writing. You could also do this in a circle, but that's a little bit more challenging and requires some skill to facilitate. Mr. Smith certainly could do that, but journaling, saying this is a way to get some students' ideas out, get some processing out in a way that's not going to really necessarily invite a harm. Ms. Clark, on the other hand, my class is a strong community, and I think talking through opinions with others will help them. So I'm going to use an external approach, and I will have assigned sides for a structured academic controversy. So this is where students are, by external, they're not just simply writing, but they're talking. This is what side A believes on the position. This is what side B believes on the position. Okay, what do we really believe? And we're going back and forth, right? So it's much more external and engaging. Now, what I want to do is, again, suggest a couple of things. One is that this is really context dependent. Two, it's really relying on teachers' judgment and some clarity on their own stances, understanding of their students, understanding of the issue. And it's not always linear. Like, you don't always just start analyzing the issue for potential harm and work through steps 1 through 4. You might have some different instincts already about where you want to go. Ultimately, though, what I recommend, and in the framework, I have sort of sub-bullets for each one of these. Here are some things you want to think through if you're thinking about how can you responsibly lean into the controversy while also mitigating harm. So I'd like to be really clear as I sort of begin to wind down here around what this framework is. And I always suggest that it is guidance to consider, particularly during pedagogical uncertainty. So these are the moments, when you're just not sure what to do. And we all face those as educators. I think for me and many folks in higher ed, how do we approach Palestine and Israel for the past couple of years has been something that we've wrestled with, right? And many people just chose to ignore it, right? But if you want to get into the topics, and if you want to bring them to your students, but you're unsure, this is the way that you can begin to think through, how can I do this in a way that's both going to do honor to the issue while also really protecting the identities and well-being of the students, okay? It is not firm guidelines or the only approach. I recognize there's different ways we can do it based on our classroom culture, our issue, the context of what we're teaching in our class, et cetera, et cetera. And I also like to always say this is a starting point for engaging students. It's not an endpoint. And you can certainly imagine building off of these. And Mr. Smith, for example, who started with reflection, going to much more sort of involved and deeper engagement with the students around the issue, where they end up taking some action or doing some imagination of different future possibilities. So it is just a start, a way into the controversy. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is, can we leverage the wisdom of teacher, what they bring in terms of their judgment, what they bring in terms of their values, and what they bring in terms of their pedagogical tools to help manage this dilemma, to balance this tension between the value of teaching controversy and our responsibility to mitigate harm and affirm students. So a few things I want to kind of wrap up on here in terms of this framework is, one, it's a starting point, not an end point. Next, that local context and classroom context really, really matter. And so I think this is a flexible and adaptable strategy, our framework to use, but it really requires some wisdom of, like, well, the communities that teachers teach in and their classroom community. And I also think, having spent a lot of time the past few years working with elementary teachers as well as middle and high school, that age and particular vulnerability of certain populations matter, right? And that can vary by context, right? And we can think about, we've talked about trans students and undocumented students, as I think when we think through, institutions of higher ed and Harvard University, we need to think about viewpoint diversity, right? And, like, what are the dominant sort of views, and can we allow for and protect the well-being of sort of all positions that we come across. And finally, this is something that could warrant a whole other presentation. It's certainly an underpinning here, and there might be some questions around here, is that there's a real sort of balance that you're doing here between objectivity and moral clarity, right? And it's the idea that teachers do not want to espouse any ideology, and we don't want to indoctrinate, and we want to allow for as many ideas as possible to be in our classrooms. That's what education is about. At the same time, there's a certain line that we have internally around what is morally right? And what do we do when there are certain viewpoints, policies, or actions that we find fundamentally immoral, right? And so that's something what we need to wrestle with as teachers, while both wanting to create the most open and possible classroom space to have, and also recognizing that there are some things that are just going to be morally objectionable. How do we handle that? So I began with a story, and I want to end with a story. And the title of the story is "If Not Here, Then Where?" I'll take you back to 2015. This is my first year at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, having dinner with Mira Levinson, who does amazing work around civics and ethics, and Judy Pace, who does some great work around controversial topics, and a few other folks. And during the dinner, Mira was talking about a new case that she had written at the time around civic action projects, where eighth graders get to kind of choose their own issue and research and advocate for it. And the issue came up around, I believe it was gay marriage. And it was, what do you do when a student wants to advocate or be in opposition to a policy that some students could be threatening to some students, right? So if you have a student that's really supportive opposes gay marriage and wants to advocate for that in their project, how might that impact LGBTQ students? Or how do you want to allow for that in your classroom? And so Mira was sharing this case, and I was like, I want to do that in 2003. I was, that was coming up around the W. Bush's second election. And students brought it up in my civics class, and I just shut it down. I said, we are not going to be debating people's humanity, right? I'm the product of a biracial marriage. That used to be illegal. We are not going to say that there's any two folks, grown, consenting adults, that cannot get married. We are not going to have that conversation. A lot of moral clarity, felt really good about the decision. And Mira kind of looked at me and took it in and said to me, well, Eric, if they're not going to have that conversation in your classroom, where are they going to have it? And I really thought about it. They're hearing about these issues on TV. They're having these conversations in the hallway. They're having these conversations in the in their dining room tables at home. So why not bring it to a classroom where I can do some thinking and some processing and some curating and really leverage the classroom culture? And a light bulb went off that in fact, we really need to be centering these conversations in our classroom, no matter how charged the issue is, because it's going to happen anywhere. So let's do it in a space where we have some skill, some thought, and some real goals around it from an education standpoint. And I'll just conclude with just going one step further. In many respects, what we were arguing for with this realization I had in my discussion with Mira and Judy was that classrooms should be these places where we're really practicing civic discourse, where we're giving kids the skills so they can go out to the real world, perhaps the highest level of decision making to the United States Congress, where we can talk across differences in a meaningful way. And I believe this to be true, that our schools need to be places where we prepare young people more so now than ever to engage in discussion across differences, whether it be in the workplace or at the highest levels of the United States government. But I'll go one step further. And I would say that perhaps we need to flip the paradigm completely and look at our K-12 schools as bastions for civic discourse. That when we look at the work and we see that what young people are doing in classrooms and what teachers can do in terms of having discussions across difference about really probing what people think and why, building up empathy, understanding values, that classrooms can actually become true sites, true bastions of civics discourse. And so it's my hope that the teachers out there doing the good work can continue, and that as an education system, we can move more towards having these conversations that both really dig into the controversies while also creating places where students are not harmed. So thank you very much for taking the time to hear a little bit about this framework. I'd love to open it up for questions and comments.
We'll start with the first question from Andy Zucker. Controversial civic-related issues should be discussed in K-12 science education too. Do vaccines cause autism? Should vaccinations be required for certain groups, etc., to enter schools? Is this TikTok post about nutrition in RFK Jr. accurate? Have you worked with science teachers?
Great question. Very little. I have worked with a few districts where it's been a sort of an open professional development. And the majority of teachers I get are social studies, but I have gotten a couple of science teachers. And I think for the very issues that you're naming right now, I think it's more important than ever.
And the next question comes in from Ann Thomas. American history is now a battleground, with many states barring the teaching of the history of race and racism in this country. The impact is to erase Black history, including slavery. How can teachers in states and school districts that are required to erase Black history to include this controversy in their teaching?
It's a really hard question. So let me try to take this up in a couple of ways. First, by naming that, I do a lot of work in states where these restrictions aren't in place: Massachusetts, New York, California. But I've also worked with some states that very much have these in place, and I think there's a few ways to think about it. The first, I think, is around thinking about values, right? And what are some fundamental values that we want to uphold? And if you look at, for example, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the founding documents, right? There's a certain stated values and then certain principles around freedom and equality, right? In those very same documents, without sort of doing any indoctrination or without doing any kind of sort of like DEI, you can just look at the exact words in those documents and you will see words and phrases and ideas that uphold the institution of slavery. And so my recommendation is to really put the values of democracy, to center those, right? But at the same time, engage with sort of the facts of inequality in ways where it's not so much sort of theory or position, but it's really kind of just putting up the document to itself and put it in the mirror and focusing on that. I think that's one way. I think the second thing that I think is really important to say is that there is a certain set of facts about Americans' past, right? There's all sorts of interpretations that you could take around American history, but there's certain facts, right? The institution of slavery is one of them. And so I think what's really important is that for schools and districts to think about how can we really argue for and ensure that we are teaching facts and really think about partnerships. If you look at sort of the Association of American Historians and other professional groups are really saying that, hey, we recognize that there's a lot up for debate, but there's also some facts that we want to lean into. And so I think that really doing that is key. And so my recommendation for teachers is, as much as possible, can you find, even in places where there are these restrictions, districts or schools that will shield you a little bit? So I don't have as much as recommendations for the school leaders and the district leaders, but I have found districts in states with a lot of imposition on what can and can't be taught that have put up some sort of shielding for teachers and say that you are going to be able to teach these things. And so for teachers, I think the biggest thing you can do from a classroom perspective is to really partner with a leadership at the district and school level, provide a little shielding to let you teach some of those factual realities and hard realities of the past. Big question. I hope I could answer it a little bit.
This came from Andy as a piggyback to Anne's question. What about potential harm to teachers? They are being fired or censured for raising such controversial issues.
Thanks for that question. So I think that's why I'm very reluctant to come out the gate and say, teachers should just teach the truth regardless, right? You have to be really thoughtful of that. And so it really does vary. I work with a lot of young teachers, and they're kind of the nation is their oyster in terms of where they want to live and where they want to be at and where they want to teach. And you can be much more thoughtful about where you land. I've also worked with veteran teachers, right, that are entrenched in a community, that have a mortgage, that have bills, that have kids. And it's like they're really worried about their job security. And so I think that, that part of that is sort of managing that dilemma and thinking about your values of like I have to be able to have some security in my job, and I want to teach what's right. I do think there is some wiggle room in there to negotiate, like, let me get closer to the history that I believe, let me get closer to exposing or engaging students with the ideas that I think are important. But there are some real constraints on teachers. And so there are some individual decisions that need to be made about how much you want to, push against that. I do think it's healthy to have folks that are pushing back against some policies that are really restricting the ability to teach facts. I also think it's really wise for people to look after their own individual well-being. So there's some individual situational negotiation that has to happen there.
The next question is from an anonymous person, but it says, how do we discern a difference of opinion in contrast to a different set of facts?
I think that question in of itself is a really great sort of teaching tool right there to say, like, what is fact and what is opinion? And so then we really begin to look at what is evidence and how do we interpret evidence. And so I think that, giving kids both the language and the analytical tools to do that is unbelievably powerful. So, I mean, there's certain things, right, that we can begin to look at around sort of what do we consider to be empirical evidence, and what do we consider to be sort of inferences or judgments or interpretations that we make based on evidence. And I'll again go back to the Constitution of the United States. I mean, it says in writing, there's no debate about it, right, that 3/5 of a person counts as property. 3/5 of an enslaved person counts as property, right? It says in the Constitution that the slave trade would be allowed to go on for nearly 2 decades after the establishment of the Constitution. So those are facts, right? Now, was the Constitution a document that upheld freedom or promoted oppression? That's an interpretation that might be up for debate, right? And so I think that we can anchor students in some empirical sort of facts and really kind of teach them what that is. And also name, here are some interpretations. There might be some really reasonable interpretations that I feel strong about, but those are interpretations, and have kids sort of wrestle with that. So I think really digging into sort of the types of evidence that we use and the types of interpretations we make is really, really key.
The next question from another anonymous attendee. What emerging challenges do you see on the horizon for teaching and learning around controversial topics and civil discourse?
Well, I think the previous question just named one of it. I do think that, if you're in a classroom, I kind of draw like these, I draw a diagram right now to kind of show you, but I think that there's always this space where we want to be as open to as many ideas as possible in our classroom, even if they're things that we disagree with, right? But I do think that there's 2 key challenges, that openness that teachers want to have. One is some legitimate challenges to what we call facts, right? And not legitimate, that people are trying to make challenges around what we think is facts, right? And so I think that that's one real sort of threat right now, is that we got to have a common ground of evidence, a common ground of understanding, of which we could have different interpretations, different positions, fundamentally at odds. But we have to have a baseline of certain facts. And so, as that becomes to become threatened somewhat, I think that's one challenge, right? And I think we do, as teachers, need to make a very intentional, reasonable stand on what the facts are and really put those forth in our class. But that can come in conflict with some policy right now. So that's a challenge. The second would be, I think, the heat, right? And I think we're all aware of this, the heat of the debates, the heat of the discussions, that you and I can't disagree without you sort of devaluing me as somebody that's evil or radical or crazy. And I think we get this a bit from both sides, maybe more from one than another. But I think that it's become a moment now where we feel, I think, boxed in, where we have to really disagree in a way that we're attacking people. And I think that that is a real challenge. And so both the sort of the heat of the conversation, and I think the murkiness of some established facts, I think are the two biggest challenges that we're facing right now.
A question from Alvin Cabrera. How would you modify your framework and/or approach for college level students?
Great question. And I actually do it with college folks. And I would say I would use it exactly the same, but some of my thinking about how I apply different steps would be different based on my audience. So let me give you a really good example. I have a colleague here at Harvard who does, I think, a really powerful assignment where he's working with leaders, future leaders, and he makes them do a role play. And he forces them to take on a position of a leader that believes fundamentally in opposition to what you believe in as an individual. And that's hard to do. And I'm not sure I would do that with my middle schoolers, high school. I'm very reluctant to have them assume roles, to do role plays around things they really, really disagree with. Sure, you can explore the different perspectives, but when you really ask somebody to embody something that they're fundamentally disagree with, I think that could be really risky. And so if you have the framework, right, I would really be against going to that role play when those issues are really important to students and forcing them to assume that role, right? K to 12 students. However, when you're talking about a 30-year-old that's about to go out and lead a school or lead a district or lead an organization and have to engage with folks that are coming from all different walks of life, and they're going to be doing that next year. And our job here is to prepare professionals to do that. I think with a little bit of sort of prefacing and previewing and letting students know, I think that's totally a reasonable thing to do. But the idea of sort of thinking about, can we mitigate harm? Definitely want to have a conversation with the students beforehand, give them heads up about the assignment, and say, hey, this is coming down the pike. If that's going to be hard for you, please talk to me, but you got to do it, right? And I think you could push students a little bit more along that spectrum to be more of the argumentative place at higher ed than you could with K to 12. So that's just one example. But I do that with my graduate students all the time. I apply this framework. And like I said, for Gaza and Gaza and Israel, the first discussion I had with a group of graduate students that had a great community. We had been together for 18 classes. We were having a structured circle. It was just to express ourselves because I had done some of the analysis. I said, there's a high degree for harm on multiple positions here, and I don't necessarily want us arguing back and forth out the gate. So let's just have a place where we can kind of listen to each other and see where we're at. And so I applied it in my own classes, and I've worked with a few different organizations in higher ed to do the same. So I think it really does apply. It's just you're thinking about a different audience, so you're going to make some different decisions. Great question.
The next question comes from Mushumi Khan, and I apologize if I said that incorrectly. How can we help teach these skills on candid, constructive conversations to current high schoolers before they get to college?
So typically when I, present this framework, there's usually, 2 or 3 other trainings or activities that I'll do, and some of them around the specific skills that students need. I think it's a few things. One, I think it's around, and it's more than just skill, it's also sort of dispositions and values. And so I think what you can do is a couple things. One is you always don't start with the complex, start with something that's a little bit more simple, right? So how can we get kids to practice disagreements, right? who is the best basketball player, who is the what's the best dessert, right? And begin to sort of say like, what are ways we can disagree. But there's also some deep work that needs to happen around values, right? And so what are some fundamental values that we have? And some of that is sort of surfacing what students have, but some of it is sort of teaching about like what are some like basic sort of human needs as a class that we want to articulate that we think all people should have, right? And so as you begin to think about like what are different sort of ways we can disagree, ways we can talk about it, how can I disagree with an idea, not the person? How do I think about values and how values are supporting the judgments I make? Of course, how do I use evidence to support my opinion? How do I take a position that I have and sort of see a counter argument? There's both sort of, I think, a set of skills and sort of a deeper set of dispositions and values that we can be teaching explicitly in sort of smaller activities, lower stakes activities that we can then bring together for some much more rich and complicated conversations. I would also sort of put a big plug in for this idea of a structured academic controversy. I didn't go into much detail about it, but it does provide a real structured way for students to walk through different sides of an argument, draw on evidence to support different positions. And what I love about it is that the goal of a structured academic controversy is not to win, but it's to come to consensus or understand where differences lie. And how powerful is it for students to say, well, I believe X, but Billy believes Y because. And it's that because that we're sorely missing in our discourse today, where people are just sort of attacking you because they're an idiot, because they're evil. But no, this is Billy's argument. This is Billy's values. And I think that's really powerful. So I think just, planting both smaller activities that really focus on particular skills or dispositions, and then much more sort of complicated discussions that are multi-pronged, I think can be really powerful. And a structured academic controversy is a great way to do that.
And as the last question from Stephen Evans, is there value to teachers revealing their own potential biases to their students?
Oh, and that's the one I get 2 minutes for. Okay. So let me answer this in a few different ways. The headline is that I think teachers want to, as much as possible, keep their own positions, reserved, right? You don't necessarily want to get out there and kind of say, this is, my position on this issue, generally speaking, okay? At the same time, I think first of all, there's no such thing as objectivity, right? What you say is just as powerful as what you don't say, right? And so if you're not bringing stuff up and you're not talking about it, that's also taking a position. You're always going to be choosing topics to present to your classes, documents that you're bringing in, topics that you're bringing in, perspectives that you're bringing in. So whether you say your view or not, you are sort of, your bias is going to be present somewhat, right? But in terms of like explicitly stating, I believe this, or this is my bias here, there is a sort of a great line of thinking that if you were going to reveal sort of your position or your bias, you do so specifically, intentionally, and explicitly. And what do I mean by that is that if you're going to share your bias or your particular stance on the issue, there should be an educative reason why, right? And so one thing you might do is say, I believe X and Y and Z. Here's my evidence and here's my reasoning. So you're demonstrating both evidence and reasoning, right, to your students. You've also made some internal reflective decisions about why is it important that I say this, right? So you've thought through this, right? I believe teachers should have some issues where they say, you know what, I have a position, but I'm going to not share it. Whereas other issues, you might say, this crosses that moral clarity line that I did, and I really need to take a stand and take a position, right? We also have to admit to that teachers are humans, right? And sometimes there's just stuff that weighs on us heavy, right? And so do some intentional reflection. When you do reveal it so it's educative, and be specific, right? Don't paint in broad strokes. So I would really be reluctant for any teacher to criticize a leader, a thinker, a politician. I think they could be critical of a policy, of rhetoric, of action, right? And so be specific and intentional when you can.
I will let you answer one more question because you were very succinct, Eric. How do you hope this work evolves in the next few years?
It's a great question. A couple things. One is I mentioned a few questions back around the idea of values and what role do values play in sort of helping students along this different framework. So whether you're doing some reflection or whether you're looking at different positions or you're arguing different positions, really getting clear on like how we can think about the role that values play in our stances, how we communicate them, and then how can we explicitly teach and cultivate and surface those values for students. That's one place I hope to go. I hope to see this work evolve. The other is, I think, kind of the extreme. So I'm in the K to 12, but I think mostly about middle school and high school. So what does this look like at the elementary level? Young students are certainly capable of having really robust conversations on controversial topics, but there needs to be some sort of, I think, guardrails in terms of what we're asking our young people to do. So what's that sweet spot where we can push young people to have some controversial discussions, but really recognize what's age appropriate? And then the question we got earlier around like higher ed, like what does this mean to push this up into sort of beyond high school? So higher ed or just beyond high school, like what does it mean for this to be part of the public discourse? And how can we think about different conversations and containers for folks to engage in real conversations across difference around important topics?
Thank you, Eric. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us for more signature events soon. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal events. Thank you and good evening.